Two, one, two, three, four.
Ja, meine sehr geehrten
Ladies
Damen
and
und Herren,
gentlemen,
liebe Freundinnen und Freunde.
dear friends,
Der Titel meines
the title of
Vortrags
my
ist
presentation
ein Zitat.
is a quote.
Das Original
The original
findet sich neben vielen
was found among other obscene slogans on the wall of a dirty prison toilet in Saudi Arabia.
Dort wurde der Satz
There, the phrase secularism is the solution was found or discovered by Raif Badawi, the Saudi Arabian blogger, who has been sentenced to 100 whip slashes for its calls for tolerance, freedom of thought, and respect for human rights. In his letter from jail, Badawi described what he felt when he found this sentence that was so different from the other slogans he usually found on the toilet. I was deeply surprised and delighted by this beautiful phrase. To read something here in the midst of hundreds of vulgar slogans and words written in the different Arabic dialects on these dirty toilet walls. That meant that somewhere here in this prison there was at least one person that understands me. Somebody who understands what I was fighting for and why I was imprisoned. Secularism is the solution. This phrase did not only encourage Badawi to bear the terrible conditions in Saudi Arabia, it contains also a central teaching that comes from the study of history, because it's true. Without secular norms, without separation of religion and state, nowhere on earth, we will have freedom, peace, and justice. And this is nothing new. Already about 230 years ago, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the American Declaration of Independence and later U.S. President, proclaimed the separation of religion and the state, saying that religion is a form of tyranny that, and I quote, provided humankind with suffering, and during 10 or 12 decades, came up with so many cruelties that it is clear that they cannot be participants in governments. Why is this the case? Why does religious power go along with violence, and why is secularism the solution? Let's take a look at the terms. You can define religion in different ways. Schleiermacher, for example, presented religion as the sense and the taste for the unlimited and the eternal things. This is a rather wide definition, and we will not deal with that kind of definition, given the fact that most of the representatives of religion with their narrow-minded anthropocentric worldview, they do not have a true sense for eternity. What we're interested in is religion in the narrow sense. So what we call normally religion, religious institutions, rabbis, priests, pastors, imams, etc. What we connect to this kind of people. Religion in this sense, I would define them as institutions of worldview that derive imperatives for the world of man from supposedly revealed statements on the origin and the structure of the cosmos. And also, violence can be defined in different meanings. And I would propose a very narrow definition for this presentation. So, violence, in a narrow sense, means the illegitimate damage or vilification of persons. And we differentiate between three forms of violence: direct violence, for example, rape or killing; structural violence, for example, laws that discriminate certain groups of professions or certain groups of people; when C, cultural violence, for example, the vilification of people in images, in texts, or in films. This kind of vilification is illegitimate always when they go against the principle of same consideration, of same interests, and go against the ethic foundation of all agreements regarding human rights. And now let's take a look at the relationship between religion and violence. First of all, we can say that religions are probably the most powerful agencies of cultural violence, because the vilification of people who think differently and believe in different things is, as we all know, part of the religious core business. There's no religious that would not differentiate between the good people of their own faith and the bad people who do not belong to their community. And the sacred books are not oriented along the lines of human rights that are universal and are valid for everybody. Historically speaking, this is obvious. And how could have people who set up the sacred books years ago would have been able to formulate or come up with human rights that have been generated years later? It would have been a miracle. It would have been a proof of God, evidence for God, if Moses, at the time when he came down from the Sinai, from the mountain of Sinai, instead of the Ten Commandments, would have come up with the General Declaration or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And something like that never happened in the history of religions. But people came up again and again with the same things. So the gods and their respective commandments were always only as clever or as limited as the people who came up with these fantasy commandments in the respective historical context. And this means religions are cultural time machines that transport outdated ideas of past ages in today's time. And that leads to conflict with the humanistic culture of human rights that came up and developed during the last decades. We see two different principles here. So the secular culture of human rights is based in an ethic monism, meaning one and the same principle is applied to all men in the same time, and this means that discrimination due to gender, nationality, color of skin, sexual preference, etc., or cosmovision is not possible. Religions, unlike the religions that are based in a moral dualism, so they differentiate between people who belong to one's own group and those who don't. And this is why it would be also wrong to talk in singular of the Christian ethic or the Muslim ethics, because every religion knows, independent from all conflicts, now two different moral systems. First of all, the religion moral inside the community that defines the relationship to one's brothers and sisters in faith, and a religious external moral that defines how to deal with people who do not belong to one's own group. And it's very important not to mix up these two moral systems, because for people who belong to the group, the in-group, other norms apply than for people who belong to the out-group. And this explains why Yahweh, God, or Allah, on the one side is merciful, mild, and on the other side he's cruel and also intolerant. Because obviously Yahweh, God, Allah, is only mild and merciful to those who succumb to his commandment. All the rest will be completely annihilated and destroyed, as it is described in the Old Testament, or they will be thrown in the oven with a fire where the evil shout and cry forever and grind their teeth. This is the New Testament. The Quran has even more fantasy with regard to the pain in the hell, because the Last Judgment, the unfaithful do not only expect hell, but they will be beaten up, they will be put into hot water, and so on. So cultural violence that expresses itself in this kind of vilification does not stay in the virtual world of texts, images, and films. It easily becomes the trigger of direct violence. And you don't have to take a look at the crimeful history of the religion, because the present times is very shocking. So the biblical claim that you should kill that you need to kill witches, and thousands of children of so-called witches were sacrificed. And the Quran that calls for the annihilation of those who do not belong to Islam, also the 1,000 lashes that Raif Badawi was sentenced to, are expressions of this direct violence in the name of religion. The cultural violence that manifests itself in the sacred books does not only manifest direct violence, but also provides for the basis for structural violence. So in a country with the most important locations of pilgrimage like Mecca, the Islam is a state religion. You cannot practice other religions openly. This is why even the Shiites are limited in their religious freedom. Opinions that do not agree with the Sharia are not allowed to be expressed. Structural violence is especially referred to women that are only able to carry out legal business with the approval of their men and need to hide in long black garments. Compared to the situation in Saudi Arabia, we live in a paradise in Germany. But we all know structural violence that is based on religion is still present in Germany, wherever the churches are still very powerful, especially in their own companies. They continue to follow their moral dualism and discriminate against groups. A physician, for example, can lose his job in a Catholic hospital if he leaves the church or is homosexual. So we cannot accept this kind of violence. But as I said, if you take a look at the situation in other places of the world, religious discrimination for people in Western Europe are rather small. Why is that? Well, we are fortunate that in our region in the last 250 years, especially in the last 50 years, a secularization took place. What does secularization mean? In a nutshell, It means the process of the replacement of religious value by secular standards and norms that are not prescribed by a higher power, but that are freely negotiated by the members of the society themselves. From this perspective, violations of human rights are not accepted, even if they are explained with long-standing old tradition. The fact that we here in Western Europe live in a rather just and free situation owes itself to the fact, to this process. It doesn't have anything to do with the Christian Occident, as Rolf Bergmeier already displayed earlier on. On the contrary, the freedom that we enjoy today are not based in Christian values, but on the continuous liberation from these values. This is something that people like Raif Badawi in the Arabian countries understood. This is why they claim for a similar secularization process in their countries. Their motto is not secularization is a solution, but secularism is the solution. And there's a good reason for that. Because secularization can only happen if you have enough secularists. So people who welcome the replacement of religious norms by secular norms and commit to that actively. In the Islamic countries, the political movement of secularism in the last year increased in number and is of special importance there. Also because people like Raif Badawi face a lot of anti-secularists, people who do not favor the replacement of religious norms by secular norms and would like to go back to the past for several centuries. And now we come to an interesting paradox that is underlined by the subtitle of this convention. The process of secularization provides us with a wonderful opportunity to solve global conflict, but at the same time, on the other hand, it is also one of the reasons for the rise of global conflicts. So what we describe today as fundamentalism is also an upset attempt to fight the process of secularization that we see everywhere. And I agree here with Hamed Abdel-Abad in all the aspects that he mentions. So at a closer look, fundamentalism is not a sign of strength, but it is a sign of the weakness of a religion. It is a weakness of the religion because they do not agree or not catch up with the social development of a society. So fundamentalism is the desperate attempt to reinforce foundations that are shaking. Because the virus of free thought has reached the last corners of faith and of the world, also due to the internet, and infected also the clergy. And this explains also the deep hatred that fundamentalists attack the new world or the new free thinking with. Fundamentalists fight in the unfaithful also their own doubts about their faith that they feel in themselves, but they are not free to express. This is also why people who converted are very especially fanatic, because they need to prove to themselves that now they are on the right track. So the decisive question is, how can we fight the massive resistance of the anti-secularists? What can we do to enhance the process of secularization also in those regions that are characterized by religious and pre-modern norms and standards. In this context, it's good to take a look at the European history. We can ask ourselves, how did the European countries manage to free themselves from the religious embrace? Obviously, there were political and economic reasons, because the less people suffer in this world, the less they need to wait for compensation and in the world beyond. And apart from that, there was also another reason for the special success of secularization in Europe. The secular mindset and body of thought was not only brought by external people to the religious institutions, but it found also people who were in favor of this body of thought within the churches and the religious communities. And it is remarkable how radically the mainstream of academic theology changed within the last 100 years. There's almost no Western theologian who speaks about the only true faith or from the divine order of creation where a woman has to succumb to the man. The torture of hell are not very fashionable today, like the dogma of the resurrection of the dead, of the body of the dead, that until the 80s led to the fact that people in Germany, certain people who were burned after their deaths were not able to have a Christian funeral, because it was difficult to imagine that they could rise from the dead once their body was burned. Secularization really advanced in Christian theology, and I realized that on a Christian convention where I was invited as a speaker recently. So some of the most or the well-known theologians praised secularization as a progress of a society, and they praised it as a success of the religions. So you ask yourself, how can that happen? So how can you see in the replacement of religious values a success of religion? This and many other things are possible by the miraculous. And how can I put it? I'm speechless. It's just a fascinating mystery. It's explained by the fascination and the mystery of exegesis. Exegesis is the art to read from an old Christian text or sacred text the exact opposite of what it meant originally. As a philosopher, I have problems with this approach, but I have to admit that on a political level it can be wise to use this trick, because the reinterpretation of the sacred texts is obviously a necessary intermediate step to make sure that people who are still captured in old dogma, to free them from the depth of the madness and to provide them with a perspective that is more secular and enlightened. So this intermediate step of reinterpretation is necessary, because we cannot expect that billions of people on our planet that from early age on have been influenced by religions will change their convictions from one day to the other. For many of them, secular attitudes can only be acceptable if this does not go along with a complete loss of their religious identity. And this is why the liberal theology has an enormous political significance, even if from a critical, rational perspective, you cannot agree to that perspective. So the function of liberal theology as an interface between religious fundamentalism and a religious secularism is being accepted and seen more and more. Aya Ajeali, she said recently that Islam per se cannot be reformed. She published a book with the title "Reform Yourself." So even if Reggiali separated from Islam, she formulates 5 theses in her book. It's 5 imperatives for a basic reformation of Islam. First, make sure that Muhammad and the Quran can be interpreted and criticized openly. This means, among other things, to approach the interpretation of Quran in an historical, critical way. Second, focus on life in this world and do not focus on life beyond this world. This goes against the glorification of death and martyrism. Third, limit Sharia and its primacy with regard to the secular rights, separation of the different powers. Stop to be able to impose the right and to
der gläubigen Muslimen bis in die intimsten Bereiche ihres Lebens vorschreibt, was sie zu tun und was sie zu lassen haben. Und 5. gebt den Aufruf
to end the virtue terror. And 5th, stop the call for jihad. So this is, in the best sense, secular positions. Secularism is more than laicism. It does not want to initiate a consequent separation of state and religion, but it also wants to convince as many people as possible to stand up for secular basic values, because without a secular basic consensus, there won't be a secular society. In order to be able to share this secular basic consensus, you don't have to be necessarily be an atheist or to agree with this consensus. You don't have to be necessarily an atheist or an agnostic, but you have to be open for certain approaches. Interestingly enough, some of the theologians developed concepts that agree with Aya Ajehalin's concepts and ideas in Germany. For example, the Islam theologian Muaran Kochide focuses on a humanistic Quran interpretation that for some people here is hard to imagine, but he strives for that. And not only Muslim fundamentalists, but also the established Islam associations are irritated by that. So he believes that it is the task of the Western world, and especially the task of the intellectuals, to protect reform Islamists and to support actively their attempts of reform. A-religious people should commit for a certain perspective in a religion sounds strange, but there's a good reason for that, because the decisive border between the so-called clash of cultures is not between the theist and the atheist, but between the secularists and the anti-secularists, between people who live in the 21st century with regard to the worldview and those who still live in the Bronze Age with regard to their mindset. And we know from the history that almost every culture is characterized by a moral dualism. So the strict differentiation, separation between the members of the in-group and the members of the out-group. Secularism provides the opportunity to face and to counteract this dangerous ideology, because a secular society needs norms and standards that are valid for all the people and comprehensible by everybody, independently from their respective preferences of faith. And this is the crucial separation or distinction between secularists and anti-secularists. While anti-secularists enhance or underline the level of group and want to press the individuals into the corsets of the norms of the groups, the secularists underline the level of the individual person and the level also of the one humanity that faces the big challenge to create more just and equal and free conditions for everybody. So, along the line with the motto of our convention, to give peace a chance, if we want to enhance this process, we should work together with religious people that group ideologies lose significance and importance, because an enduring peace will only be possible if we do not understand ourselves, first of all, as Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or atheists, but as members of the upright walking species of naked apes who all have the same rights and who should treat their little blue planet at the periphery of the Milky Way in a way, a more cautious way than they did in the past. Thank you for your attention.
Gibt's Fragen? Haben wir Zeit? Ja, ne? Ich war.
Is there time for questions?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Once again, my name is Leo from Nigeria. I have two questions. What do you think about religion without theology? Yeah. What is the future of religion without theology? Because I think that all the discussion about fundamentalism, I think has a lot to do with the theology. It has nothing to do with how we feel. I mean, we join the same taxi, pay the same money. We fly the same aircraft, even though sometimes some people may have other intentions, they may have different destinations, So it is theology. What is the future of theology in the context of secularization? Is it going to survive? And where do we put it if we are working for the secularization of the world?
Ich habe hier versucht, hier darzustellen, dass
I tried to illustrate that it is not okay from an intellectual perspective to read from a text the opposite of what it says. So if we did the same, like what theologians do with their scripture or with their texts in Germany, like with texts from Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, or Kant, you would not get a chair. So somebody who's able to read the opposite in the texts of philosophers does not qualify for to be a professor. In theologians, the opposite is the case. They need to be able to read the opposite in a text. And obviously, I desire for a society where this is not necessary anymore. But we know that the process of secularization in Germany or in Europe succeeds only because this kind of interpretation is happening. And I talked to a lot of Muslims. Mina, we talked a lot about that, and they cannot even imagine this. And I talked in the UK also with people, because you believe that you take texts for serious.
Das ist aber nicht die Auffassung von Theologen, die
But this is
historisch-kritisch ausgebildet wurden.
The attitude of theologians who studied the critical historical approach. Because Christianity was also always a political phenomenon. Every religion, if it is effective, is a political phenomenon. But we have this interesting process of self-secularization of religions. And I talked to a lot of religious professionals, and a lot of them speaks only a religious dialect that sounds rather pious, but this is not what they really mean anymore. And it would be huge progress if a process like that would happen also in Islam. We would still talk about dishonest interpretation, but the situation would be different. We would not have a situation where people who do not obey to the virtual terror are held accountable from the government. So we have the same terrible sentences. Some are even worse in the New Testament. Like the revelation of John is one of the most terrible texts that has been written. In Quran, I did not see texts like in the final chapter of the New Testament. They're really cruel. And nevertheless, the theologian managed to interpret it in a way that it is, the grand finale for people. And it's probably even a bigger miracle than turning water into wine. But if this is our worst problem, that we find ourselves confronted with people who are not able to read texts appropriately, that would be a success, because then we wouldn't have the global conflicts. I believe there's no better poison for a vital religion than a historical critical theology, because they destroyed themselves more than we could ever do from our perspective. And they did so also because they were under pressure, under external pressure, the double enlightenment. You need critical people of enlightenment to say this is nonsense and this is inhumane, and you need these free spaces within the religion that are used by the people who speak differently from us, different than we do, but who in many ways have the same positions like we do. To come back to your question, I can imagine a society where without theologians, Star Trek can do without. And it was developed by Gene Roddenberry, a humanist. But I believe that as an intermediate step, we need people who can convey to other people that what the text say is not what they believe, because basically what the texts say is the content of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Mein Name ist Theo Ebert.
Ein Herz für Theologen. Das wäre doch eine schöne Kampagne für uns.
I'm Theo Ebert. I thought you were a theologian. Let me just remark. It was not mainly theologians or theologists, but it was philosophers like Spinoza and so on, and theologists incorporated Taneb and so on 200 years later. So I think there is a major difference. Theo, you're exactly right. They didn't have come up with this idea on their own. No, of course, I had to be somehow to get motivated. And Islam, it's maybe a bit more difficult. But let me just criticize slightly your notion of violence, which is always damaged and illegitimate. That's the narrow definition of violence. But violence can also be defined in a different way. It's not only a question of definition, but there is also the state monopoly of violence, which is not right from the outset connotated negatively. And I think it's a mistake to say violence has a negative connotation and in the regular language is not used. And insofar, it can be rephrased easily and just take the part of violence which is illegitimate, and this plays a role in religion. So I wouldn't say violence when we have a narrow definition and then this does all not fit with the state monopoly of violence. That's a broader definition of violence, where violence is defined as the capacity of putting through standards, but consciously. I couldn't, go into detail, but in a narrow sense, I wanted to say, for example, people live under violent circumstances, which does not mean that they live under circumstances where the state cannot intervene. That means the narrow definition of violence, which is addressed in the idea of violent free resistance, is connected with the idea of being legitimate. Of course, you're right, the sociology term of violence is much broader. Okay. Felix Böder, Humanist Party. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really great. I've got two contradicting views where I'd like to have your opinion. The phenomenon that has reoccurred frequently, that groups having freedom of opinion demonstration is abused to just abolish this freedom. How to deal with such a phenomenon? How to react? Does a society have to somehow just suffer from that, or do politicians have to react? That's my first question. Second one, going to the subject that we need a liberal theology. I share your opinion entirely. I'm involved in many Facebook discussion fora, and I've seen that believers have been devaluated a lot and subject to vilification, but humanists are the major opposition, and in some areas, when we discuss it with them and when we talk about their dishonesty in their intellectual approach, they can be very radical and then leave their basic view. So my second question would be, wouldn't it be better to give leeway to this liberal interpretation and to somehow not address this intellectual dishonesty? Or should academic discussion, for example, about the life of Muhammad, which is such a major issue, be kept and stick to, with the risk that liberal Muslims would be re-radicalized? These are my two questions. Going to the first question first. Tolerance is always limited. There is no illimited tolerance, and people who are open for everything are not entirely sane. So we have to define what the framework is in which we can have a destructive impact when it comes to tolerating and bearing with other forms of living in our society. So we need to be somehow calm and collected and tolerant more than we're used to in Germany. I mean, we're just about debating some left-wingers addressed us because of Peter Singer, saying we must not even discuss that in a society. And this is a phenomenon which I call the imperialism, which is in German a synonym for being upset So being upset at the same time going to an imperialism. So it means that it's the striving to come up with killer phrases in the open space and neglecting any kind of rational arguments. And this is a very coined attitude in Germany. I would wish for being more calm and collected, more humorous and more tolerant. It's quite funny to discuss with people who have an entirely different point of view. And this is why one shouldn't claim that I would represent their opinion only because I'm talking to them. So in Germany, we have the fear that we could go into a totalitarian regime, but I think we've realized that our society is liberal enough to cope with fierce debate without having the public prosecutor join in. Which does not be contradictory to the other point of view that if human rights are infringed, we will not and must by no means tolerate that, and in particularly not when it comes to old, allegedly holy traditions, because the older a tradition is, the more we have to criticize it. Meaning that it stems from a time where people were just not ready for it. And recognize those things that we see today. This is not true for all teachings. What IBKA wrote 2,000 years ago is very current, but what we read in the Holy Scripts is outdated entirely. So somehow it is over its best-of date and it's gone beyond it. And the question is, what is the political consequence for people if they're not critically and liberal in a way of reinterpreting everything? And the second question, let me just rethink. What was it again? Should we then stop criticizing religion and not draw people's attention to this contradictions? No. This is the interesting thing, what we've seen in European history. Only because we had these harsh attacks by Nietzsche, Marx, and Deschner later, who is celebrating his, he would be celebrating his 91st anniversary if he was still alive. Within religious institutions, there were people to say, no, this criminal history of Deschner, it wasn't like that, but he's slightly right. And we would lose our opportunity, and this is our task in this process, is to draw people's attention to the fact what religion can produce in terms of atrocities and in how far this is a logic contradiction. And then we can hope if we have sent this message in a concentrated way, and what will be received by the religious institution will be diluted, but still be strong enough to trigger certain processes. This should all work together, but we shouldn't be so angry like having form in front of our mouth. So if someone has a weird way of interpreting a religious text, one part of ourselves should think this is all very weird, but very good. These people exist. They have glasses, weird glasses to look through, strange things they discover a normal mortal person would never discover in such a text. Mariana Pinson, Secular Greens Working Circle. Thank you very much for this exciting talk. As religion, as scholar, I would like to talk with you about the term of religion. I think that you have a point of view of monocentric theism, but I would be interested. It's very likable. You're kind of nonchalant and have a self-irony dealing with theology. And I would really like to know, because in our next assembly we will discuss theology, is this science, and is it justified to be taught at state universities? What would be the political consequence from what you just said? I mean, we as political actors have to consider our attitude and see what it means that, well, Kochritz would be supported as a secular group and what would be the effect this has on Christian theology at state universities. So what is the framework of requirements that should come up as a consequence? Very good question. Of course. And the case of the Kochritz is clear. We should stay to the requirement that theology faculties should become and be transformed into scientific institutes where religion institutions shouldn't have any access. This is also part of the program of principle and our statutes of IBKA and in all our publications. And it also makes clear this case, which is not accepted by the Islam associations because it has a historical, critical attitude and has a dedicated humanistic way of interpretation of the Islam. And one could protect people better if one could do research in an open scientific framework and if one was not forced to represent the belief or the profession of faith in one's work, and it can't be predefined what the result of scientific research must be. No, this is the contrary of research. So you can also conclude things that other people dislike. And when it comes to Christian theology, Mr. Lüdemann came also to different results than what one would have hoped for, and he is facing major problems with the Protestant Church, which is deemed to be so very liberal. So we shouldn't go into compromise. We should stick to this requirement and fight for the fact that this is being implemented, and the good theologists will then say thank you. Thank you.